Product decisions are not all made by product managers. Designers make product decisions, leaders make product decisions, engineers make product decisions, because they're all about the product. I mean, and what is a product decision? At Amazon, they talk about one-way and two-way doors. And that's really what we're talking about here, is reversibility. You made some decisions in that strategy document, and a bunch of them are reversible. They're changeable when we learn more. Some of them might not be.
How do you decide on how to decide? Every organization is different, and you might have a leader who's very much, this is what we're doing, we need to do it, go do it.
Make your decision-making conscious. Actually think about how you are deciding. Whether you follow the principles I come up with or not, just make it conscious.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Product Development Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Wakeling, and in this episode, I'm joined by Phil Hornby. Phil is a seasoned product leader, coach, and technologist with over 20 years of experience. He's also host of the Talking Roadmaps podcast and is currently writing It Depends, the secret handbook for making high-impact product decisions in context. In this episode, we talk about product decision-making, the who, the how, and some of the guiding principles that make up his new book. If you're over on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever other podcast player you're on, please make sure to follow. And also, if you'd like to subscribe on YouTube, feel free to go over to the Product Development Podcast channel and subscribe. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Phil. Product decision-making. Before we kind of break it down to the core elements, and you can talk a bit about the book you're writing and the principles that go into that, what was the catalyst for writing that book, and what interests you about decision-making and products enough to want to actually write a book on the subject?
So it's multifaceted. Where should I start? Why am I writing the book? Because I want to write a book. Let's put it that simply. I've been feeling that urge to write a book for several years, and I've had 3 or 4 attempts, very much in private, trying things with a few ideas, but they were none. They were kind of based on a model or an idea that I had, but they were never kind of tied directly to the work I did or kind of the value that I can create through that work. And for the last 3 or 4 years, the focus of my work has been coaching product leaders. And I boiled it back down that really product leaders at the core, they have really 2 big things: creating high-performing teams and enabling them and creating that environment for them, and making decisions. And so I was playing around with which of those 2 paths do I go around. And then high-performing teams is an area that I'm quite passionate about. But I think I spoke to 4 other product coaches in the space of 3 months and discovered they were writing something in that space and thought, that's going to get a bit busy.
Mm-hmm.
There's no point in competing head-to-head. So I decided decisions was a point to go after, a bit more white space. And then I realized quite how passionate I was about it. It came the wrong way around. But I realized that everything in product is a decision. Like priority calls are a decision, strategy are a decision, roadmaps that I'm best known for are an articulation of certain decisions and then inform another bunch of decisions. And so it just kind of felt right, because most of my time in coaching sessions, I was helping people think clearly and make decisions and then take the action to follow on from there. So that's really what I got back to. It's like, well, this is what I help people do on a micro level, one-to-one level. If I can help people do that on a macro level, larger number of people, with what I'm doing where I'm helping one-to-one, just felt like a natural extension.
Yeah, and it completely links in with the idea of a product person, taking this noise and converting that to clarity through making the right decisions or informed decisions. Maybe right decision is actually probably a bit of a loaded term, which is you kind of need to pick away a bit at. But
yeah.
I mean, where's a good place to start then in terms of product decision making?
Well, let's maybe take that point you made a second ago of a product person making that decision, because actually one of my core tenets is it's not necessarily the product manager making these decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Product decisions are not all made by product managers. Designers make product decisions, leaders make product decisions, engineers make product decisions, because they're all about the product. I mean, and what is a product decision? Here's the secret sauce. If you are a product business, every decision in your business is a product decision.
Right.
Doesn't mean the product managers are making them. Back in the day when I started product management, we tended to do a broader role. Like pricing was something we got heavily involved in. We'd often have a profit and loss responsibility. I still generally advocate that generalist, broad reaching product approach as opposed to just focusing on the tech side. And I think we're actually seeing a bit of a swing back at the moment in the post zero interest era of actually looking at that broader church of product work and focusing on delivering results, not just building stuff, which has kind of become the focus for a bit too long. It's a pendulum. Your product management actually started all the way over here, and it was more of a marketing role. It became more of a balanced role. It went all the way over to be more of a tech role, and I think we're coming back. And the center, I think, is the best place. Maybe I'm influenced by my own career, where that's where I started and where I saw the most value that I created. But yeah, I think we've got to emphasize who makes the decisions. There's how we make the decisions. There's what are the decisions. There's the tools and techniques that we use within them. These things all kind of come together. There's this really fundamental part, I guess. We assume that people know how to make decisions. Just think about that. When was the last time you were taught how to make a decision?
Yeah, I can't think of a time. I think the first thing that comes to my mind is just, oh, well, let me just throw that framework there and let the framework tell me how to make a decision.
Yeah. And we assume that frameworks are going to do the thinking for us and turn the handle and the answer falls out.
Is it the right framework as well? That's the other thing. Is this appropriate for what we're trying to achieve?
There's a meta decision for you, which framework to use.
How do you decide on how to decide? Every organization is different, and you might have a leader who's very much, this is what we're doing, we need to do it, go do it. You have others which are very much led by consensus, as a team, what's the general consensus of this idea, decision, whatever it might be, and that's what we go ahead and do. I think Google often operates by consensus, I think, in certain product teams. How do you approach that? What are your thoughts around that sense of, the meta, how to decide.
And I think I would actually say it's how to decide who to decide is really what you said there. Is what you expressed. There is a how to decide element as well. But the who to decide, so Bain and Co. define 4 predominant decision-making styles. There is directive, quite authoritarian, where the leader decides, the hippo complex, as we might talk about.
Right.
There is the consensus-driven decision-making, there's democratic decision-making, and there's participative decision-making. In 90+% of the scenarios in a product world, participative is usually the best option. And participative basically means we listen to all the voices, but one person owns that decision. Like, if it's a design decision, the designer should make it quite simple, influenced by other members of the team, listening to their voices, listening to their concerns. If it's a technology decision, the technology engineers should make that decision. Quite hard. I can't say one engineer because there tends to be more of them in a team. But that's usually the best option. And there's usually a tech lead or an architect that can ultimately make that choice. And so there's who's the decider, but there's other roles in here as well. Like, in fact, as I break down decision making, I actually break it into 3 key steps. First, we have to get to the decision. That's surfacing all the opinions, having the discussion, understanding the constraints, all those sorts of things. We then have to make it. And making it comes down to who's going to make it, in what approach they're going to use. Are they going to use consensus? And you know what? Consensus fits in some scenarios. Democracy fits in some scenarios. Making a design decision, generally, consensus leads to the lowest common denominator, i.e. it leads to a poor outcome. It's like, yeah, we're going to take nothing. We're going to take all your objections away, and we're left with vanilla. We can't have the strawberry, the mint chocolate chip, etc. We're just left with the plain old vanilla ice cream.
Takes away the boldness. Yeah,
we're lost. We've knocked all the rough edges off. Sometimes those rough edges are actually what makes something stand out. And so kind of recognizing that. Whereas, which pub should we go to for lunch as a team? Democracy is probably a good answer. It's like, let's just vote. Yeah, okay, we're all going for Thai. Done. That's not even really a pub, but what type of food? You know what I'm saying? Because it's not critical and it's not really going to move the needle or change life. And so thinking about the different decision-making models, I think there are, those four are slightly missing a few. There's also, I think you could say consent. There's another one where nobody is objective. Consensus requires us all to get to an agreement, whereas there's a point where we're not necessarily all agreeing, but no one's objecting, which is a subtle difference that I think we need to consider. When it comes to decision making, I think there are three primary roles at the decision making point. There is the decider, the recommender, and sometimes this one's unpopular, the veto. Let's be honest, the CEO always has a veto. They can always say, I do not give a damn what you think or how you feel, etc., etc. We are doing something different. If they're doing it right, that's because they have knowledge, they have context that we don't. Like, we need to do this integration. I can't tell you why. The real reason is probably, we're thinking of acquiring this company, or there's a strategic reason that leads to another acquisition, or we can't do that integration because we're going to acquire their competitor in 6 months' time.
Yeah.
But I can't tell you that. And so there's sometimes that requirement for the leadership to be able to say, I've heard you, but no.
Yeah, so product leadership really, would you say it's product leadership's responsibility to instill these, the way decisions are made in the company, to really articulate and to clearly let people know that this is how we do things, this is how it's going to be. So there's no, I guess, confusion and frustration later, maybe even that their voices aren't being heard or whatever else it might be.
Yeah, and I was actually having a chat with someone the other day, Jonathan Gowans. We were doing an interview that's going to be as part of my research, but ultimately turn into a podcast about some techniques. And he talked about how there were some times when he just knew he couldn't make the decision, and so he could provide the recommendation up to his leadership team and say, and like the CEO might be saying, we absolutely have to do this, and he'll be saying it doesn't make sense. Here's the reason why. Here's the pros and cons of your approach. Here's the pros and cons of the alternative. But at some point, he put the decision onto that leader to make that choice. They made sometimes the choice he didn't recommend. Maybe there's additional context. Maybe it's just their opinion driving it. Ultimately, if you're a founder of a company, for example, again, you've got the right to do what the heck you want with your company. I mean, it's your company. I know, again, unpopular opinion, but it's the reality. But afterwards, once the decision came back, you've then got things like, there's a classic sort of principle of disagree and commit. Okay, I didn't think this was the right course of action, but ultimately that person owns this decision. They get to make it. They're entitled to. It's not that they didn't listen, it's that they had a different opinion and they're entitled to that. And they're in a position of power to make that choice. There's a lot in the agile world about your decisions being made as much as possible lower down. And I absolutely, one of the decision-making principles in the book, they're all draft at this point, but one of them is make the highest leverage decision that you can make that you're empowered to make, I should say. So you're empowered to a certain degree based on how high you are up the hierarchy. If you're the CEO, you're empowered to make every decision possible. But if you're making the micro level decisions, that's not very high leverage. You're wasting your time. So it's about finding that sweet spot where those two things overlap. This is high leverage, high impact. It's worth my time because of where I am in the organization, but it's also within my zone of empowerment. And you might be trying to stretch that zone of empowerment sometimes, like saying, well, and that's where you get into kind of the recommendation sphere of, I'm going to recommend. Now, I know I've personally kind of taken the seek forgiveness, not permission approach sometimes in life. And so sometimes
I like that too.
you might be slightly outside your level of empowerment and saying, "This is what we're going to do. Tell me if I'm wrong." It's almost like, "Come on, let's have a fight." Um, you haven't empowered me yet to this level so far, but I'm going to push the envelope. I'm going to take a bit more empowerment. And I think that kind of, I think that can be a healthy tension on the boundaries of where your empowerment is. But at other times, knowing, no, this is where I limit. This is where I stop. Sometimes because I'm not personally comfortable enough to making a decision this large. Sometimes because I just know that leadership would want that to go up a level or down a level as well. The same is true. Then you might recommend up, or you might delegate down. So you recommend up with your understanding, all the details, you have the context, and you delegate down with the context as well. What do we know that we can share so people lower down the organization can make decisions as well, as opposed to holding on to them? It's, I've spotted this decision, therefore I should be the one who makes it. Well, let's find the right level for it to be made at.
What you're saying there reminds me of, I could be misquoting here, but I think it was Jeff Bezos or someone like that who mentioned the role of the CEO being essentially making 3 important decisions each day or something like that, or each week. And I guess that's it. Micro little management, micro decisions are not necessarily the important decisions. So therefore, really question whether you should be delegating that stuff, or if you're lower down, elevating it if it is more significant than maybe your pay grade. But you mentioned, before the decision itself, you said like the 3 elements. Did I miss something? The third element to that, is that post decision
Getting to making and implementing are the
right.
three kind of headlines. And the reason I put implementing there, like so far when I've looked at the decision-making space, people seem to stop at the decision or most communicating it out. But there's a story that Bruce McCarthy tells that I love. And he tells this story of how a leadership team agreed 4 OKRs. Now, 4 was probably too many for the team and the organization, but they had agreed 4. That says these are the 4 things we are going to focus on as an organization. But the CTO left the room, wrote all 4 on the whiteboard, and then struck out 2 of them and said to his team, yes, these are the 4 OKRs, but we are just going to ignore these 2. Pretend they don't exist. At which point, what was the real decision? The real decision at that point was there are only 2 OKRs. And so to me, the implementation is equally important in terms of the reality of what was the decision that was made and therefore implemented. And so you've got to think about, how do we follow on? How do we log the decisions that we've made to make sure that we can learn from them? How do we review them? How do we communicate them out? How do we keep track of them and make sure that we're all playing on the same page with those decisions, taking them forwards? Because if 2 parts of the organization are interpreted that decision differently and are implementing it differently, it's not going to work. Like the CTO crossed out 2. What if the CMO went out of the room and deleted the opposite 2? Now all of a sudden you've got 2 parts of the organization going in separate directions.
Right. Yeah, it's alignment. I mean, on that point of alignment, then how do you resolve something like that? Would you say, if you have that issue where you have some people who, disagree with the fundamental points that have been agreed, let's say the OKRs, and they go off and do that. What are some tactics, product leaders or even CEOs, I guess, at that point potentially should be thinking about to ensure that alignment is consistent across the board?
Oh, that's a hard one.
Yeah.
Fire them. Well, I mean, it's slightly tongue-in-cheek, but the reality is they were disingenuous in the room. When the decision was made, they didn't respect it. That's a deeper cultural issue in the organization. Like having that, if they didn't agree with them, then the debate wasn't done, the decision couldn't be made. Or they hadn't got to the point where they could disagree and commit. And therefore they hadn't bought into that culture that generally is needed. Like, we can't all agree on everything. If we do, we're going to spend the next year debating what color the tables are going to be in the cafeteria in the office. Something that's just not going to move the needle. And we need to be making lots of decisions constantly. Decision velocity is a key consideration in an organization because we have to make lots. If I go back to your point about Jeff, yeah, he's actually, there's a really great podcast that he was on recently. I think it's Lex Friedman or something like that, where he talks about a Blue Origin. He's aiming to make them into the most decisive company on the planet. Decision making is at the heart of how he's trying to build that organization. And at Amazon, they're already considered one of the best decision making organizations because of many of their techniques. Like they talk about one-way and two-way doors, understanding different types of decisions. But we've really got to think about, well, what is this decision-making culture? If executive leaders are not going to respect the decision-making that are made with the rest of the execs, what chance have the rest of the organization got? Culture flows from the head. So you've got to kind of make sure that you've got the right culture. And if something like that needs more debate, then give it more debate. But also just know that we can't agree on everything. It's just not humanly possible. Like I know I get Slack messages from people every day, and I'm on projects that I'm involved in, and I look at them and think, I don't agree with that, but can I live with it? Yes. Is it worth my time to go and have that debate on that particular one? No, because it's not going to move the needle enough to be worth the extra effort of getting to consensus. It's good enough. It's progress over perfection, perhaps, is a way of phrasing it.
Yeah, back to one of your slightly earlier points around this dysfunction of the team. I think it reminds me of the book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, which is a great book. And, it sounds like potentially in that instance, it could have been, those first 2 layers of the pyramid where it was, trust is a big part of it, and then fear of conflict, even potentially, not wanting to conflict at that. So they go off in their safe team and, override what's been decided elsewhere. I think particularly those first 2 layers of trust and fear of conflict are often the cause of many issues in a team as well.
Yeah, in fact, Lencioni and the 5 Dysfunctions of the Team is one of my favorite books. I'm actually copying some of the style there. There's going to be a narrative and a business style sort of content in my book.
Right.
I'm not trying to do one continuous narrative. I'm going for almost an anthology or collection of short stories that will all feel familiar. Just because I didn't feel one macro decision was the right way to carry through with the book. Seeing lots of them would be a better way, and it was going to be too much effort to string them all together and make it feel real without becoming a business novel, but without becoming the Phoenix Project, basically.
Yeah. So some do it very well. I have read other business narrative driven books, and I've been it's pretty cheesy and a bit cliche. Would this actually exist in the real world? I'm not so sure. So yeah, it's a fine line.
Yeah, but it's. I totally agree with you about the sort of the trust and sort of fear of conflict. Like I'm actually a big believer in positive conflict, and like it's quite interesting with one of my former teams that I led. I remember having what appeared from the outside to be full blown stand up arguments with people in my team, but we could because we had that trust, we had that psychological safety. If we take another angle on high performing teams as well. And it was actually meeting people where they were. Like the particular person I'm thinking of was quite a fiery Croatian. He liked to swear in conversations, and so I met him there, and we had conversations that way, and it was fiery. And people would look at us and think we hated each other. We loved each other. We still do. We still talk on a regular basis. Whereas there's someone who sat right next to him in the team, who was a very kind of more analytical German. They played the stereotypes wonderfully, if I'm honest. But I couldn't approach him in that same way and have the same style of conversation. It would be a much more, measured conversation, even if it was the same broad content. But being able to have that, what appeared to be conflict in a team, to kind of actually drive the dialogue and have the conversation, was actually really powerful and just fun, to be honest, to meet people in their own space.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I try and do in my own product work is, once I put something out there, which is, let's say, a suggested roadmap, I say to them, I've got a thick skin. Challenge me. If you disagree with any things, tell me why, and let's have a conversation about it. Let's not shy away from, if you think that's a really bad idea, just tell me you think it's a really bad idea and let's talk about it. It's good to have a thick skin, I think, particularly in product.
And I think you also hit on a really useful thing there. You called it suggested or draft or something like that on the document. We talked about the 5 dysfunctions of teams. Back during COVID, I wrote my 5 dysfunctions of remote teams or distributed teams, in fact. I don't remember all of them off the top of my head, but one of them was an over-reliance on artifacts over conversation.
Mm.
In the in-person world, you have the conversation and then you capture it and memorialize it in a document. In the remote world, people write the document, throw it over the fence, and think they're done. When actually that's the start of the conversation in the remote world. So because they finished once the document was done in the in-person world, they kind of draw the same line of finish there, but you're creating a straw man to allow for the conversation, to facilitate the conversation, typically in a remote world. And understanding that there's a shift in how you're going to get to the decision, have the conversation, is also super important.
Yeah. So I've just delivered a product strategy document myself, looking at the next sort of 3 to 5 years. And um, one thing in terms of when I disseminate it to the key stakeholders and leadership was, this is a live document. This is a living, breathing document. This is something that, as of right now, this is how it looks. But in a month's time, 3 months, 6 months, depending on the market, depending on how things go, just more discovery, it could change at any time. I think that's a good way to think about it as well. Not to say this is this, it's locked, it's sealed, it's delivered. I think open that flexibility. I think that instills better conversations as well.
I mean, I can bring it right back to decision making as well, just to do that. So at Amazon, they talk about one-way and two-way doors. And that's really what we're talking about here, is reversibility. You made some decisions in that strategy document, and a bunch of them are reversible. They're changeable when we learn more. Some of them might not be. And understanding that different facets are and different facets aren't is actually important. Knowing which ones are changeable, which ones can be revisited. I mean, let's be honest, everything is changeable in reality, but the impact of the change is higher. Some are almost irreversible. Like acquiring another company is almost irreversible. It's the cost, the impact, both politically, reputationally, money, etc., is huge. Whereas going down the street and buying the wrong sandwich from the wrong sandwich vendor, not taking a bite, not liking it, throwing it away, and going down to the next one, it's reversible. It's easy, and so we've got to consider that there are different. We've got to give things different treatment and understand the impact of changing direction. Like you putting a strategy document out there, to an extent, you're putting some of your political capital into that. You're putting some of your reputation into that because you're saying, this is what I believe. If you fundamentally flip-flop in a week's time because of one conversation with one customer, that's not going to look great. So you've got to also put the right level of due diligence in for the right amount of impact for reversing.
When you make a decision, when you make a suggestion, you have the conviction because you've just done it. At what point can you reassess that and say, actually, I was wrong, or new information has come to light, without just being someone who, as soon as they hear something contrary to maybe their original decision, they maybe fold, or they say, actually, yes, I'm sure you're right. Appeal to authority, maybe potentially, if someone says, oh, this expert disagrees with you, and so, well, okay, they're the expert, I guess I should concede that point.
In general, I think of it in terms of time boxing. It's a little bit like we're doing this in a Scrum team, right? We fix our requirements for a sprint. Because that's essentially what happens in Scrum. We've done a lot of work. We've decided what we're putting into the sprint, and we freeze the requirements so that the team can have something consistent to work against and drive towards. After 2 weeks, we reevaluate. In development terms, that's a reasonable period of time. For a strategy, it's probably a little longer. It's probably more like a quarter. As a minimum, you're going to do something. If you're constantly changing throughout that quarter, you're constantly resetting people. You're constantly basically throwing away all the thinking, all the work, all the things that they're doing, driving towards that goal. And you're probably not actually giving enough effort to see whether it was the right thing or the wrong thing, even if you get extra data. So in general, I'd say you've got to set a time horizon. It's like, this is the strategy and this is the decision we are working towards until this point. This is the point when we can revisit it. At that point, you come back and say, is it still valid? Have we learned sufficient new things that would invalidate this, that would change our direction? If not, I guess it ends up in the lean startup mindset of persevere, pivot, or stop. You've got to kind of really think about, we're getting to a point or an evaluation point. Because if we're constantly reevaluating, then reality is we haven't actually made a decision. And one of my favorite concepts is a thing that Martin Erickson talks about in his decision stack. He calls them product principles. And product principles are really where you encode big decisions in your organization so that you can all make that same decision consistently throughout the organization, up and down, across day to day. And if you find yourself in that scenario, instead of debating it yet again, you just know which way to go. And examples that I quite like, for example, eBay and Shopify, we can compare them. At eBay, they have a clear product principle, that is, they favor the buyer, not the seller. So if there's any question mark on a complaint, etc., the buyer gets looked after, the seller has to deal with it. Because they are a consumer-facing brand, and the buyers are the hard part side of the network, and so they look after those particular that group, because if buyers are there, sellers are going to be there. And if they look after the buyers, all the buyers get a great experience, and that's a nice flywheel. Shopify go the other way. They look after the seller. But it's not surprising, because their customers are the seller. They are providing a platform, and the buyers actually belong to their customer, not to them directly. And so they look after the actual seller, because by looking after the seller, that enables them to better serve the customers or the buyers, and therefore it perpetuates. And so they've got a clear, if there's a clear choice of which side do we favor, they have there. Amazon, again, going back to them, have the same sort of principle. If they have this simple decision-making rubric, or heuristic, I should say, of if there's a choice between serving us or serving the customer, serve the customer. Do it better for the customer. Because if we do it better for the customer, in the long term, that will be better for us as Amazon.
Also makes me think of, when you're doing things like ICE prioritization, adding in extra elements to that. So you've got your ICE score, and then bringing in how much does this align to the product principles you mentioned? Is this actually quite low in terms of how that's aligning to that principle, as well as general themes of the product strategy? So you have your ICE score, you have how much alignment to these product principles, how much alignment to the themes in which we're trying to focus on. And I find that quite a useful extra layer in that prioritization matrix as well.
So I prefer to use an ROI sort of an ROI prioritization method. In essence, ICE is a form of ROI calculator. It is just saying impact is the return that we're getting. I prefer to kind of customize it and actually co-create the ROI. So you typically end up with sales, marketing, development, products. We're all in the room, and we say, okay, what drives our prioritization? What makes our decisions? And I usually end up with 3 parameters. Something like strategic fit, commercial value, technical effort or complexity. Something along those 3 lines, which essentially the first 2 are a form of impact, and the last one is a form of effort or cost, or whichever way you're going, whether it's ICE or RICE. But you can calculate it out. You can put weightings on each of these factors. You can clearly define what each level is on those. So like typically I'm looking for a 0 to 5 or a 0 to 10 score on each of these, and we'll create the actual scale. So it's not gameable. Like sales can't turn up and say everything's a 10 on the commercial value scale just because they've heard a customer wants that feature. There's a clear reference point of, well, we believe this is worth up to 100 grand a year or 10 million ARR, whatever it is. Strategic fit might be, well, we're targeting customers in North America. Okay, well, these are South American customers, so they get a 5. We want to have that clarity of what the rules are, and typically product own the strategic fit, sales own the commercial impact, and engineering own the technical complexity or risk or effort. And in fact, I ask those different functions to score these things, typically at the epic or the even the initiative level. You score it. You be part of the scoring of these things, and you know what? The arguments disappear very quickly because you're all part of making the priority call. You're all part of creating the system. You're all bought into it. It's like, now there's still things that don't fit perfectly quite often, and if they don't, product management are allowed to override it. The reason being because it's going to take some time to fix the system, if indeed it makes sense to fix it, or it's just one exception. Because these frameworks are not there to actually make the decision. We're not delegating our thinking to the framework. We're using the framework to help us think. Itamar Gilad, in his book Evidence Guide, he talks about ICE. He has a lovely concept of how to do confidence scoring as well.
Yeah, actually, I use his framework. Actually, it's great. There's his confidence calculator or confidence meter. I can't remember which is the right term, but that's really useful as well in terms of bringing the evidence in.
Yeah, and for me, it's one of the points he makes in there is it's not about the total score; it's about the individual scores. It's like looking at that and saying, well, why is if the impact is particularly low, why? What's important? Or if the confidence is really low, what can we do to raise the confidence? Because that's going to drive the activities you're going to take that make sense.
I think it's around 12 or so principles that you're going to be covering in your book, right? I could be wrong in that number, but in terms of, some interesting ones maybe we can finish up with, is there a couple of principles that you can, discuss a little bit about and reveal? And
well, I have dropped a few of them in already, funnily enough. But let me, I've literally just opened my Miro board over here because I won't remember them all. So one of them is make the highest leverage decisions you are empowered to make, we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
That one's in the making the decision sort of context. In the getting to the decision, I have one that I'm feeling quite comfortable about, which is understand the context for your decision and to inform constraints. So because we don't live in a free world to do everything, like constraints are actually a great thing for creativity. One that might be slightly controversial, make decisions at the last responsible moment. There's a point at which if you make decisions too quickly, then you haven't got enough information. You're just guessing. There's a point at which if you wait too long, you've got too much information and you're too slow and you haven't moved fast enough.
Well, what are you thinking about in terms of the those elements which go into that responsible moment to make that decision? Can you reveal a little bit you're thinking about? What is that little area of the timeline which is appropriate?
So I think part of it comes back to how reversible is the decision. If it's a highly reversible decision, then actually you're probably best off making a quick decision, and the decision is to go and run an experiment before you can, and then make the next decision once you've got some more data. But one of my favorite sort of quotes in this space is, I think it's Conan Powell, U.S. Secretary of State or Defense, many years ago. He's famous for saying, act when you have 70% of the information you would like to have. Not 40. Anything 40 or less and you're just guessing. Anything more than 70 and you're too slow. And this is decisions they were using, or the amount of decision-making information they were using to decide to take military action. Now, okay, the Americans can be a bit gung-ho about taking military action, so maybe the thresholds are a little bit different. But I think there's something to that of like, don't try and get perfect information. Understand that it's going to take some time to get what you need, get enough, but also know that you can always go back to revisit the decision. It's understanding that context. How reversible? What's the impact of the reversing of it? And when is the right time? Like, for example, making a decision to do 6 months of development work for something that has to be done in 6 months, you're squeezing it then because you know everything's going to take longer. Making the decision to do something that's going to take a week that you've actually got 6 months before you decide, before you actually need it, maybe you can take a little bit longer to think about it. There's there's both ends of the timeline that constrain you, but there's the information you've got, but there's also the effort you want to put into it. How big is this thing? If this is a small decision, do you want to spend any time on it? There's two angles to it. There's conscious time and there's subconscious time. Like, your brain is constantly working in the background. And so some little decisions, if they don't need to be made, spend a little bit of time thinking about it, then kind of just put it on a post-it note of something you're going to deal with later. You'll have one of those eureka moments in a week's time. Yeah, that's what I should do. It makes sense because your brain has figured it out for you in the subconscious. And so sometimes you can leave your brain to deal with it and almost forget about it and it'll make it itself. But there's only still so many threads like that that your brain can deal with as well. So you want to also not fill it up with 1,000 subconscious threads it's dealing with. So it's about how much conscious time, how much subconscious time, how many threads you can deal with going. Like, the average human can call something like 7 plus or minus 2 things in their head at any given time. The more decisions you're holding on to, the more threads you're holding on to, it's distracting you from all the other things that you're trying to work on.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned like the number 7 twice there, the 70% reference and then 7 plus minus 2. It does seem like 7 is when it comes to me, the way I feel about the number 7 is actually kind of like it's a safe number. Like, if you rate something 7 out of 10, you're not overcommitting to say it's really great. You're not undercommitting to say 6, which is a little bit low feeling. But 7 is that like sweet spot, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. It needs some more thought on that one.
Yeah, I think very deep with that one. But just in light of time and wrapping things up, I mean, are there any sort of final principles or maybe some final thoughts you can share in terms of key ideas for people to take away from this podcast, or maybe some warnings around what are the things to avoid maybe in some of these decision making processes and products?
The big takeaway I would say is make your decision making conscious. Actually think about how you are deciding, whether you follow the principles I come up with or not. Just make it conscious. Don't just bumble into a decision. Think about the structure, and if there are multiple people involved, take them all on the same journey. Help them get to that decision, understand all the context, etc. Help them make the decision and help them implement it as well, kind of following on from it. So kind of all go on that same journey together. Even if you're not doing all the parts, one of the biggest things that goes wrong with decision making is someone goes into the room and thinks it's an obvious choice because they've gone through all the thinking, they've got to that point, and everybody else is kind of 5 steps, 3 steps, 10 steps behind them. And they go into the room and they get frustrated because nobody's on the same page. It's because they haven't been on the same journey together.
Yeah. Yeah. And if your team is dysfunctional, make it functional and then continue. Yeah, Phil, it's been really fascinating. It's been great talking about decision making and many tangents, but it's such a huge topic, and I'm excited to see the book in due course. Where can people find you online and follow your journey more?
Probably the best place, let's go for the book side, is itdependsbook.com. That might hint at the title. The book is going to be called It Depends, because that's the answer every product manager ever gives when they're talking about a decision.
Excellent. Well, Phil, I appreciate your time, and look forward to speaking again soon. Thank you for joining the podcast.
Great. Thanks very much. Have a great day.
You've been watching or listening to the Product Development Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to leave a rating and comment on YouTube as well as a share. The engagement really helps grow the podcast into the future, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.